Thank you for letting a Texan come up north and share probably some unpopular opinions in some cases. I was asked to talk about novel approaches to starting newly arrived cattle on feed. And anytime we say novel in our industry, often that is controversial. Our industry is a very traditional industry for good reason, but it can be difficult to implement change sometimes. But at our facility at West Texas A&M University, we have a similar facility to this. Ours is set up more like a feedlot, but certainly the research that I show in this talk, most of it was done at our facility at WT. I think it's very translatable to the stocker scenario. We did a lot of lightweight stocker calves in essentially indoor and dry long essentially, and look at different management practices, different vaccine techniques, different things. And I'd like to discuss 3 major topics today that we're doing work in that certainly could be considered novel within the beef production system. I'll talk about nutritional management and a study we just completed that's not published yet, but is somewhat similar to the work being done at this facility, looking at a higher energy approach to starting newly received cattle. I'll talk about changes that I believe are occurring in the industry that are inevitable and how we use antimicrobials to treat cattle for bovine respiratory disease and other diseases as well. And then we'll finish off with some work we've done recently with looking at respiratory vaccination and how effective that is in high-risk cattle. I do want to say that most of the topics I'm going to talk about pertain more to that high-risk animal. So we're not talking about, heavier weight, backgrounded cattle. These are lighter weight, 4 to 5 weight, high-risk cattle sourced from auction markets. So let's start with nutritional management. The current dogma, I would say, in the industry, as far as nutritional management of newly received cattle, and especially with high-risk cattle, is they require several days of bouquet post-arrival and a receiving ration that is a majority forage. Very low concentrate, not a lot of starch in the ration. And the reason for that is, and I do believe that hay can certainly bring calves to the bunk, and that's very important, but also we have concerns with acidosis, right? And if we bring calves in that have been on a primarily forage diet before they got there, and we start them right on a really high starch diet, that can cause digestive issues. But I'll talk about some trade-offs here in a moment regarding that. And so some work that was done in the 70s by a gentleman named Glenn Loftring, and from a series of research studies that he did, we developed this idea that in these higher risk newly received cattle, diets that are higher in roughage, we tend to have better health in those cattle if they have a higher roughage diet, but we reduce their performance compared to a higher concentrate diet, which we typically see the opposite effect. Let more health issues with the high concentrate diet, but those cattle overall gain better. That's the current dogma. I mentioned digestive issues. One of the challenges and one of the things that I think may have driven those health differences in that older work in the 70s was they may have had some acidosis in the cattle on the higher concentrate diet and thought it was BRD or diagnosed it as BRD, because one big challenge we deal with today is differentiating these 2 diseases. An animal that's acidotic and an animal that has BRD can look very, very similar and have very similar signs. So it's hard to separate those diseases out. One is a metabolic disease that essentially antimicrobial treatment's not going to do a lot for, and one's an infectious disease. So that's an important distinction we need to be able to make, and we need research and technology to do that. The issue with feeding a higher roughage diet to newly received cattle, or a challenge, if you will, is those cattle come into our operation. They come through the auction market process, and do they eat and drink normally for the week before we get them? Not very well at all, right? And so most of these cattle are arriving in a negative energy balance already. We need to correct that negative energy balance. And these cattle don't eat very well either. And the reason why, there's lots of different things that drive that poor appetite in these newly received cattle, but inflammation and stress-induced inflammation from stress, but inflammation from infection and being transported and having bruises and injury from the truck, inflammation causes anorexia, or a lack of appetite in cattle. And it's a very strong effect, and it's very consistent. But other factors as well that cause this very, very low intake, especially the first 2 weeks on feed. We recently looked at 7 different high-risk loads. Our cattle, I guess I can name my order buyer. So I use Capital Land and Livestock. They're one of the largest order buyers in the U.S. Their headquarters is north of Austin, Texas. And they buy a lot of cattle out of East Texas, South Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma. So to give you perspective, our feedlot is in Canyon, Texas, just south of Amarillo. So it's about a 12-hour truck ride from the order buyer to our facility. This is 7 different loads. You see when we receive them, and then I'm showing a lot of data in kilograms. I apologize, I was kind of too lazy to convert it to pounds, but double that, and you get pounds essentially. But the percent body weight holds true, right? The first 2 weeks on feed, pretty close to 1.5% body weight is about all we can get them up to. And the first week of feed, which is this load 7, that was only the first 7 days, even lower intake, right? And so we have this challenge that we want to give high roughage, but they're not eating very well, plus they're in a negative energy balance that we need to correct. And it results in this what I call this receiving diet paradox, where we have these 2 opposing factors that are kind of working against each other if we're feeding a high roughage diet. And so we wanted to look at a completely novel way of starting newly received cattle. I'm showing you on the screen our standard receiving diet that we use in our feedlot. And notice, it's got a fairly low amount of corn, a fairly high amount of hay, and quite a bit of fibrous byproduct in it as well that is a really cool product because it doesn't have a lot of starch in it, but it has quite a bit of energy, almost as much energy as corn. This is our typical SOP for our receiving diet. Our finisher diet is here, and this is a pretty typical finisher diet that you'll see in a feed yard in the Texas Panhandle, with quite a bit more steam plate corn, quite a bit less hay, and we switched to a lower quality hay, and then about 20% sweet bran, or wet corn gluten feed is what sweet bran is, okay? And what we did is we just brought high-risk cattle into our facility, and we randomized half of them to start on our typical receiving ration, and we randomized the other half to start on our typical finisher ration. And we did not limit feed these cattle. So that would be the big difference between some of the work done out here and what we did in our study, is we managed these cattle just the same. I did not limit their intake. We we have a bunk management SOP, so we don't just fill their bunks up full, we gradually increase them, but we manage both diets the same. Going into this, I didn't know what we were going to see. I thought we may have a major acidosis outbreak and be in a lot of trouble, but I'll talk to you and show you some of the early results that I've literally asked my student to pull out of his dissertation that he's writing that I've got here in the talk. Don't focus too much on these numbers. This is somewhat of a placeholder for me to make sure that I'm portraying the results accurately, but I did want to point out a few that are highlighted. And first, let's look at dry matter intake in high-risk cattle that were started on these two different diets, very different diets. And intake was greater for the receiving ration early on, okay? Not all of them were statistically different, but then, kind of after the receiving period, that equilibrated. I should also note that the receiving diet group was transitioned to the finishing diet starting on day 56. So this is a full feedlot study, and we took them all the way to harvest. When we look at energy intake, based on their dry matter intake and the energy concentration of those two diets that I showed you, a little bit unexpected, but not really, because the receiving cattle just ate more feed, and therefore their energy intake was slightly higher early on, but then as the finisher ration started to eat more feed, that kind of flipped, okay? Looking at the performance of the cattle, the first 2 weeks, pretty big advantage to the receiving group. In fact, the finisher group actually just kind of maintained body weight that first 2 weeks. We got a little bit of gain out of the receiving group, and I think this is largely due to filth, right? So when I buy these cattle and they show up at my facility, they're shrunk 6 to 8%. And if we have a much bulkier diet that those are eating, they're going to fill up and refill their gut contents a lot quicker than a more dense, high energy diet. So I think there's a lot of fill effect in that early gain, but look after day 14. Pretty clear advantage in performance to the cattle we started on the finisher ration all the way to the end of the receiving period, okay? And because they ate less and they gained more, we had marked improvement in feed efficiency for the cattle started on the higher energy finisher ration, which also translated into significantly improved cost of gain if we started them on the higher energy finisher ration. Pretty dramatic total cost of gain differences between those two diets. I mentioned the dogma, right, about from those 1970 studies, and if we feed a higher concentrate diet, we have more health issues. We did not see that whatsoever in our study. Almost identical health outcomes, whether they started on the higher roughage receiving diet or we started them straight on the higher energy, higher concentrate finishing diet. And so for nearly 40 years, from that series of research that was conducted, nutritionists and producers have had it in their mind that, if I give too much energy, I'm going to cause more morbidity issues. And I'm not sure if that's the case. The other big difference today, I mentioned the sweet bran product. That's a byproduct of the wet corn milling industry. We didn't have those products back in the 70s when this original research was done, right? And remember, the big advantage and the key to sweet bran or dry distillers or wet corn gluten pellets or whatever high energy byproduct you may utilize, those are fibrous byproducts that don't have starch and don't tend to cause acidosis issues, but yet they're very high in energy. And so we can really utilize those byproducts, and our diets are different today than they used to be. Much safer from a metabolic standpoint. Okay? We're about to conduct research, speaking of acidosis, this probably pertains more to feedlots, but to try to really get a better understanding on acidosis and therefore liver abscesses, perhaps. And is acidosis really a diet issue? Is it how hot the diet is? Or is it more of a bunk management issue? And can we mitigate that through limit feeding or better bunk management and really reduce the risk of acidosis? Okay, so that's topic number one, and that's some recent nutrition research that we've done. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
The outcome, very simple. The death percentage is twice the picture average. Was that just done luck? Or, I mean, were anything else that was pretty similar, or?
No, that's an artifact of small pen research. And if you don't get that, so you could flip I could do this again and it may flip. Because it is a well-replicated study. There was, I think there was 20 pen reps per treatment. I didn't cover the methods very specifically. But that's approximately 200 head on each treatment. So that's a difference of like one animal. The morbidity data is much more reliable though, just because it happens a lot more often than death. Let's talk a little bit about antimicrobial use in cattle. Very difficult job, right? It's very challenging to ride a dry lot pen or ride a pasture and with high confidence pick out animals that we think are truly affected with BRD. It's the system we have. It's worked for us for 50 plus years, but there is certainly technology, I think, that's emerging that may assist us with this very challenging job. The other issue is labor, right, as well. We've talked about, especially in our feed yards, but even at stocker operations, labor and skilled labor that can do a good job of this is very, very difficult to find. Why are cattle hard to identify for BRD or any disease? I mean, it has to do with evolution, right? And the fact that cattle are prey animals and their inherent instinct is to hide disease from a predator. And you are a predator when you ride into that pen to them. And so they naturally want to hide their disease, and it makes the job pretty difficult. But there's technology available today that kind of overcomes that inherent instinct of cattle to hide. And there's ear tags that we can place and put in the ear of cattle that continuously measures how much they're moving around, whether it's in a pen or a pasture. And when cattle get sick, or when you get sick, how much do you move around? Not nearly as much when you feel good, right? And so we've done quite a bit of work just looking at the activity of cattle that were treated for BRD, the Archon group, and the triangles, or I'm sorry, that's the control group that was not treated for BRD, Archon, and then the BRD affected cattle in the squares are our case. And clearly, from the start of the receiving period all the way out to 56 days, activity is significantly greater in those cattle that don't get sick versus the cattle that we do treat for BRD. And this is all generated from an ear tag that we place in the ear of the cattle and sends that data automatically to a receiver at our headquarters, and we can look at this data in real time. So this was just continuously in several thousand head of cattle over the 56-day receiving period. You can also look at, gain insight in how cattle behave throughout a given day, right? And so here again, we're showing cattle that were not ever treated, at least clinically, for VRD, and those that were. And the cattle that were never treated moved around quite a bit more, and especially at key times during the day. The cattle were fed around here, and that's why the activity increased. They're fed here. They consume their meal for the day. They kind of relax and ruminate here, and if they're ruminating, they're not moving around as much. And then here's that typical afternoon activity that we see in our feedlots, but if you look at it close enough in your pastures as well. Cattle just like to get up and move around again at the end of the day. But certainly we're finding that same difference in activity between sick cattle, the cattle with the squares, and cattle that did not get sick, the cattle with the triangle. Okay? And again, this is from an ear tag. The problem right now, or the biggest challenge, is just cost benefit. If I pay $10 for using one of these tags, I better get at least $11 back, right? Or $10.01 back. And that's probably the biggest challenge. I've gone through and done just a quick math equation of if we do it the old way, where I'm horseback or on my four-wheeler, and I'm driving and pulling based on what I see with my eye, versus if I implement these tags that continuously monitor their activity, and it also gets rumination time as well. We may actually increase morbidity with the novel system, because those tags are constantly monitoring those animals, and there's probably a few cattle that we just miss that now we're going to be able to find with the technology. Okay? Hopefully, though, our relapse rate, or the number of cattle that need a second treatment, is reduced for this novel system because we find them earlier and more effectively, and hopefully they respond to antimicrobial treatment better. Same thing with mortality, is if I'm able to find more of them that are affected with VRD and find them earlier and treat them earlier, hopefully my death loss is reduced slightly by using this novel system versus the way I do it now. And that's really where our return on investment is we're probably going to treat a few more, so it's going to cost us more in drug costs, but we're going to have less relapse that we're going to capture value with, and we're going to reduce our death loss slightly because we're finding them quicker, treating them more timely. And that's where hopefully we have return on investment. The problem is, right now, today, if you're to buy one of these tags, they're like $50 to $75 a piece. Okay? So they're not cost effective in my opinion at the moment. However, there's a new company about to launch a product, a tag, that they say that they're going to charge $7 a tag for, and it gives you this similar information, plus it's an ID tag that's stampable, and so you wouldn't have to buy an ID tag along with it, so you could save $1 or $2 there. So now I'm down to about $5 a head if I want to consider this technology. Here's some of the challenges, some of which I probably mentioned, but you've got to individually identify animals to use this ear tag technology and monitor their behavior, right? Because in order for me to get a flag of an animal and go out in my receiving pen or my receiving tract and I can find it and pull it, I've got to utilize individual animal management. There's definitely some roadblocks to culture, and we're so dang traditional, right? And so it's a completely new way of managing health in the stocker scenario or in the feedlot. So we must recognize the benefit. Pen riders have got to realize the benefit. That's going to be a big challenge. The other issue, especially in the feed yard, I can't like print a list off, right? Of here's 300 head that their activity reduced drastically over the last 48 hours. The technology is saying, I think you need to pull and treat this animal. I can't hand a pen rider a list with 300 individual ID tags on it, spread out across 30 or 40 pens, and tell him to go identify those and pull them out. Because it'll take him all day long and he'll get highly frustrated. So we've got to have either a light or, based on location, a heat map on a phone, which that company I mentioned, that's their approach, that'll help me as a pen rider go find those suspects and whether I want to pull them or not. Generates a lot of data, so you got to be comfortable with that, but the software makes it easier. It takes care of some of that. And there's going to be flexibility in how we define our case definitions. I'm not going to make my pen riders probably pull cattle for BOD completely based on their activity. If they see an animal that they think is clinically ill or getting sick, and they're a seasoned pen rider, and they weren't flagged by the technology, I'm going to trust his judgment and allow him to pull that animal. Another area surrounding antimicrobial use and how things I think are going to change in the near future would be with metaphylaxis. So what I've just been talking about is pull and treat, right? Kind of backwards, because now I'm going to talk about metaphylaxis, and we give metaphylaxis at initial processing, right? But what I was talking about in those ear tags and that technology, that helps me pull and treat cattle after I've turned them out into my dry lot or my pasture. Now I'm talking about targeted metaphylaxis. Now I'm talking about, I've got 3 truckloads of high-risk cattle lined up that I'm about to process, and I've got 100 head on the first truck. And metaphylaxis is one of the most effective management tools we have to manage high-risk cattle. And we give metaphylaxis to all 100 head on that truckload, right? Targeted metaphylaxis is where now we're going to use technology or information at the individual animal level to now, instead of me giving all 100 head on that truck a shot of Draxxin or Zuprevo or whatever, now I'm going to use information and selectively find which of the 50 or 60 or 40 of those 100 really need the metaphylaxis. Pretty important and a pretty good concept, right? Because number one, what is our consumer asking us to do? Use less antimicrobial. And number two, if I can find the right 50 out of my 100 head truckload that really need the Draxxin and not give Draxxin to the 50 that are going to be fine without it, am I saving money? Quite a bit of money, right? And so a very important concept that you're going to see research and discussion on further moving forward. It's got to be fast enough, ideally, that we're not slowing up processing, right? The test has got to be repeatable and accurate. If it's not accurate, I might as well flip a coin, right? And so there's some challenges to overcome. There's a lot of research that needs to be done before this concept is perfected, but you're going to hear a lot more about it. Just moving from a population basis of a truck and treating that whole truck the same to more of an individual animal basis. But there's certainly savings to be had by you, the producer. So some conclusions on antimicrobial use would be our decision-making process and the way we use antimicrobials in our system has not changed significantly since we've been producing cattle and had antimicrobials available. We are right on the cusp, though. You're going to hear a lot more about these technologies and different ways to better identify sick cattle and different ways to manage and target metaphylaxis and in the near future. How do we target metaphylaxis in our facility? And what research have we done? We've done a lot of research with advanced animal diagnostics, and they have a Q-Scout machine set up on the other side of the chute that I'm sure you're welcome to see how that works. And that's a blood test that I can get a quick small blood sample from an animal that enters my chute, and it runs that test in about 35 to 40 seconds, I believe. And based on the leukocytes, or the white blood cell count of the animal, and research that's been done to know if an animal has this blood count, they're much more likely to be sick, I ultimately get a green light, which would be that animal's normal, it doesn't need Draxxin, or I get a red light, that animal is abnormal and it probably needs a shot of Draxxin. So that's one way we can target metaphylaxis, but there's other ways too that you guys already know, right? If I buy a load of male cattle that are 4 weights, what percentage of those cattle are going to be bulls from a typical order buyer? More than half, right? At least mine are. So mine are about 75%. So about 1/4 of them are steers. Bulls, on that truckload, if they're a bull, they're 3 times more likely to get VRD than if they're a steer. So there's another metric that I know instantly by palpating that animal's at higher risk. What about weight in relation to pay weight? If my pay weight's 500 pounds, in reality, I've probably got a range from 400 or even 350, but 400 all the way up to 600, right? If my pay weight's 500, I know those calves that are closer to 400 pounds are at greater risk for VRD than the other side of the bell-shaped curve, right? The heavier animals. So weight within the group in relation to the average can certainly indicate health risk. Other research we've done, so I started to notice 6-7 years ago, and with my order buyer, about 30 to 40% of the cattle I buy, high-risk cattle from auction barns, show up with a ranch tag underneath. So we started documenting that and looking at health outcome and calves that show up with a ranch tag and those that don't. If they come in with a ranch tag, their morbidity and mortality rate is half as much as if they don't have a ranch tag. Why is that? Is the ranch tag a really good treatment for VRD? It's just a proxy for previous management, right? If they show up with a ranch tag, I know they've been through the chute at a cow-calf operation at least once. They're probably more likely to have been vaccinated at the cow-calf level where vaccines actually work. And they're probably managed better nutritionally as well. And so it's just a proxy for health. So if you notice that in the cattle you receive, just be aware that if they have a ranch tag and show up with a ranch tag from your order buyer, they're probably much lower risk for VRD. Let's close with respiratory vaccination and high-risk cattle. I've been conducting field vaccine research for nearly 15 years now and have published dozens of publications. And I think I am just as confused about MLV vaccination and high-risk cattle today than I was 15 years ago. There's a couple things that I think I've figured out that I'll mention as we close out. And this, again, this is high-risk cattle. What is a high-risk animal? High risk is not a 20% morbidity rate and a 2% mortality rate. I'm sorry. If I could get that average, I would love it. But we average probably 60% morbidity, and we probably average about 4 to 5% mortality. And true high-risk cattle that are auction barn cattle, a good percentage of them are traded, they're lightweight, they're bulls, all those things, they're commingled, all those things, and we average probably about 50 or 60% morbidity and about 4 to 5% death loss. So my comments pertain to that type of animal, a high-risk animal. BRD is, you're looking at what's called a causal loop diagram, and it's related to BRD and all the things involved in it, and this is the simplified model. I didn't put the complex one on there. But BRD, bovine respiratory disease, is the most complicated disease on the planet, human or animal. Okay? It involves stress. Stress causes immunosuppression. Immunosuppression allows both virus and bacteria to be in a more favorable environment in the animal. We deal with almost a dozen different pathogens with this disease, both viral and bacterial. And so I do not hesitate to say that this disease we deal with is probably the most complicated mammalian disease on the planet. Okay? Vaccines, and I'm talking about modified live viral vaccines, a 5-way that would have IDRV, BVDV, PI3, and BRSV antigens in it, right? MLV vaccines are widely used, but unfortunately, the adoption rate is really flipped, in my opinion. MLVs are going to provide prevention against viral infection much better if they're administered before the animal is stressed, right? And before that animal is challenged naturally with the virus in the field. And so we have got to move vaccination upstream to the cow-calf level. But if you look at the data, only about 40% of all calves being marketed are administered a respiratory vaccine before sale. And as you would expect, the smaller the operation, the less likely I am to give an MLV, right? If you look at how we use vaccine or MLVs in the feed yard, it's almost 100%, okay? But in my opinion, when we're trying to prevent viral infection with a vaccine that takes time for that animal to appropriately respond to that vaccine, that practice is much more effective when given at the cow-calf operation than at the stocker facility or the feedlot facility. Some people even use respiratory vaccines along with an antimicrobial to a sick calf. And I was kind of shocked at this number, but we do not do that, and everything I know about immunology and vaccines, I would never suggest giving an MLV to a clinically ill animal that's affected with BRD. Remember, BRD is very complicated, but I use COVID a lot recently to give students and producers context, but if you got COVID and went to the doctor, do they give you a vaccine really quickly at that point? No, because it can actually make disease worse. If I've got a calf that's naturally infected with IBR and I give them an attenuated strain of IBR and a vaccine, I can actually make disease worse if I do that. So I do not do this in our feedlot whatsoever. We're going to close out with one last study though, and all the kind of the background I've given you on what high-risk cattle go through to get to our stocker operation, the stress, the sorting at the auction barn, the 90 different sources on a 100-head truckload, which means a ton of commingling, which is very stressful on cattle, right? Why? Cattle are big on hierarchy, right? If I place 100 head in a pen and they're from 90 different ranches, those cattle are sorting out who's at the top of the totem pole, who's in the middle, and who's at the bottom. And that is super stressful on cattle. The dominant cattle want to establish their dominance in that pen right after processing, right? And that's stressful on them, and they pull and they're mean. The really docile cattle, that's very stressful on those animals as well because they get picked on, right? And I think it's stressful on the middle cattle to watch all that bull crap go on, right? So commingling is a big stressor. Is it plausible to think that some calves are already infected with virus before we get them? Yeah. And so we did this study to look at the two major tools that we have in our toolbox to hopefully improve health outcome. One is metaphylaxis. In this study, we used Draxxin. The other is a 5-way MLV. Okay? And I won't bore you with the details, but essentially the results I'm going to show in this study, half of these cattle got Draxxin, half did not. Half of these cattle in the study got a 5-way MLV, half of them didn't get any MLV for the entire 56-day receiving period. Okay? Here's what we found as far as morbidity rate. For the cattle that received Draxxin, the meta group in the yellow bar, versus the cattle that did not receive Draxxin. The maroon or the dark red bar did not receive Draxxin. Here's the morbidity rate. If they got Draxxin, 20% of them got sick. If they did not get Draxxin, over 50% of them got sick. And you see that every day, right? You see how effective metaphylaxis is if you miss a group or you misclassify a group, or we know that metaphylaxis is highly effective. And there's plenty of research data out there to support that. With randomized control studies, looking at cattle that are randomized to receive Draxxin and the other half that aren't. Okay? That even carried into second, as well as third, and even really, we went all the way out to 4 pools in this study. Okay? Clearly, Draxxin and metaphylaxis with Draxxin is just the drug we use in this study, still highly effective at reducing morbidity in our cattle. The 5-way MLV, so the yellow bar, those cattle were vaccinated with a 5-way MLV. In this study we used titanium 5. And then the red bar, the dark red bar, did not receive an MLV at all during the entire receiving period. And at least statistically, no difference in health, no difference in treatment rate whether the cattle got the 5-way MLB on arrival and they were rebacked on day 14 at LDAD, or they got no MLB at all. Numerically, there is a slight reduction, at least numerically, for the calves that got the 5-way, but then if you look at like third treatments, it's kind of the other way, at least numerically. But statistically, the measure we use where I have confidence that this bar is different from this bar, the stats are saying that those bars are not different, okay? What does that tell you about efficacy of metaphylaxis and efficacy of 5-way MLB vaccines? Pretty clear difference. There is consequence, can be consequence, to giving a 5-way MLB as well. If you have, raise your hand if you've had the COVID vaccine. No, do not do that. I do not want to start a brawl. But if you have had the COVID vaccine, I mean, you may have felt some pain and some swelling. You may have developed a fever from it. I mean, in these 5-way MLBs, there's actually more antigens in those vaccines than just one. They're different types of vaccines. But certainly cattle develop a febrile response. You see this black line, and they're vaccinated here, and had a clear increase in temperature in response to the vaccine. And the viruses replicate inside those animals if they're MLB vaccines. So I am not going to tell you how to vaccinate your cattle today. What I want you to do is think differently about vaccines, and MLB vaccines in particular. Some reasons why they may not work as well. The timing isn't always great. Cattle get sick very quickly in the receiving period, and if we give a vaccine right here, and we're pretty much done pulling over in here, well, here's the response to that vaccine over here. It takes 2 to 3 weeks before we have solid protective antibody levels from that vaccine. So the timing is not always great. A lot of these cattle, as I've alluded to before, are coming in with virus. We measured 269 head of cattle across 4 different truckloads, and we swabbed their nose. We sent those swabs to the lab and had the lab look at, okay, how many of these cattle have IVR, BVD, VRSD, and PI3? Just a snapshot look. This is that initial processing. And it's pretty highly variable, but every load pretty much had every virus in some of the cattle, okay? So they're coming in with virus a lot of the time. And when we give a live replicating virus to an immunosuppressed animal, and I think everybody would agree that a true high-risk animal is definitely immunosuppressed, they're going to shed that vaccine origin virus just like a natural virus. If they're stressed, which is the CHR group that's chronically stressed, versus if they're not stressed, they shed much, much more virus if they're stressed than if they're not, okay? And so that's another thing to consider as well. So I'll finish up here. First of all, thank you for your attention. I don't know how long I went, but I'm glad to take questions. But let's think differently and ask questions and do the right type of research that challenges dogma, so that hopefully we can make progress on this BRD issue that we are not making very good progress on. MLB vaccines may not always work, but their use is never harmful. It's kind of the dogma we've had. Reconsider that and think MLB vaccines administered at the wrong time in the wrong animal could be detrimental in some cases, okay? With that, thank you very much. That particular study was not an intranasal, it was a parenteral titanium 5. We're doing quite a bit of intranasal work recently. I'm not ready to share that data quite yet, but I will be in a couple months. There's a lot of interest in intranasals for various reasons. It stimulates a different type of immunity, right? There's a lot of perceived advantages. It stimulates local immunity. The onset of immunity tends to be a lot quicker, so the timing might be better. But I'm not going to use intranasals until I see more research and understand their safety better. The problem is, I didn't know if I was going to get it here or not, but in the past, I'm not going to blame anyone, whether I'm blaming USDA, because USDA is responsible for approval of vaccines, or if I'm going to blame the manufacturers because they sell and profit off of them. But we've had this dogma that vaccines, at worst, they don't work and they don't do any harm. And so we rarely, in large field studies, under the conditions that we give them in high-risk calves, we rarely ever see negative control vaccine studies. It's this vaccine versus this one, or this timing versus this timing. We need more negative control vaccine studies to really understand how effective they are, mainly, but are they safe to use in high-risk cattle, because the label indication says they're not. You're not supposed to use them in stressed cattle, and you're not supposed to use them if they're going to be exposed within 14 days.
You said if I will, are you castrating them on delivery, banding them, or are you waiting?
I think so that's the next topic that Dr. Tarkoff's going to, I think I'll wait, if you can stick around. I'll just say one quick comment. We banned, and it's really just a labor thing for us, because I rely on student labor, and so in general it's a little easier, it's a little less skill set, but you can screw up the band too, if you don't get it tight enough. But we ban primarily because of labor, and then we also give meloxicam. After a third treatment, here's my opinion on processing. We do not wait to process. I don't know, right? That research is hard to do. I think there was one study done here recently. They looked at like 1 day, 2 day, or 3 day wait. By waiting 3 days, those cattle are more chronically stressed at the end of the third day than they were when they got there. So it's not an immunosuppression thing. It's more of get some water in them, get them filled up, but they're more stressed on day 3 than they are on day 0. And so we don't wait to process. The other reason why I don't like to wait very long to process is, at least in the past, the cattle I get need metaphylaxis right then. And so the quicker I can get a shot of Draxxin or Prevo in them from arrival, usually the better the timing is. We've looked at on arrival, we've looked at delaying to day 28. I was getting along really good delaying to day 28 up until a couple of years ago, because 90% of my first polls happened before day 28. And so I didn't put those, they were challenged very, very early before I felt like that vaccine had time to kick in and provide some protection. And then by delaying it, I take that antigen challenge out of the picture, right? And so I felt like I was getting along pretty well delaying to day 28. the cattle I've been getting the last couple of years, I still have those cattle that I'm waiting to open the gate at the end of the post-metaphylactic interval, right? 7 days for Draxon. There's a quarter of them that I'm looking at them during their 7-day moratorium, and I'm wanting to pull them. We don't because of research reasons, but you know, we pull hard on day 8, right? And because they break early. The last couple of years, we've had those, but I've had a lot of cattle first cases coming up day 28, day 35. And so if I back up and give the MLB on day 0, I may get some vaccine efficacy out of that for those later breaking cattle. They're still breaking. They're still getting treated. I think the bottom line is the effect is not very large, at least from the available data that exists in the literature, where there's a true negative control compared to a vaccine X or Y.
With your activity monitors, are they just looking at your steps, pedometer, or are they looking at rumination? What activities go into that evaluation?
Yeah, I should have put a photo in there, but I didn't. But that data that you saw was generated from an ear tag that has a 3-axis accelerometer inside the ear tag. We work with Allflex quite a bit. Merck acquired Allflex, but they're Allflex tags. They're about that big around and about that thick. They're pretty lightweight. They weigh about as much as an EID tag. Oh, great. So we got some pictures next, but that's what that data was generated from, was an ear tag. We've used pedometers on the leg. That's a problem in the feed yard. I mean, they get caught on the dewlap. I don't see those probably being commercially used. The ear tag, yes.
But what activities is it measuring?
How much that tag's moving around. There's a 3-axis accelerometer in there. And if I shake my head and that thing moves, there's a pendulum, so to speak. It's an electronic pendulum, but it indicates how much that tag's moving around.
Comments on the axis of the activity. It looks like there's like 10% difference, which I would expect a lot more. The comment, I mean, did you change your axis up with half the activity? Just if you look from 0 to up here, it looked like it looked like a very small difference in activity, and I would expect it to tell a lot more difference in activity.
Keep in mind that graph that I showed you from 0 to 56, that's confounded by the fact that across time, some of the cases had recovered, and some, see what I'm getting at?
But how much activity are you losing then in this?
We're talking over a 50% decrease probably. Yeah. And it gets hard to look at that, right? You get overwhelmed by the numbers if you don't show it all.
As an alternative to the activity monitor, what's happening with using body temperature? Does it happen like a bolus implant, or does that have potential?
Commercial potential? No, not a bolus. Because we use boluses quite a bit to measure pH of the rumen, but also temperature of the rumen. I showed, this is rumen temperature from a bolus. And look at the cases. Look at the BRD cases, BRD. And again, this is confounded by time, but look how much the temperature increased. The black line, those cattle were never treated for BRD. The problem is I got to retrieve those boluses from the plant. Tyson doesn't like lithium batteries because it's going down into the all. So I don't think that's the problem with the bolus. Is if it's got a battery in it, it's got to be retrieved. One more question. Yeah. The question was, do we change drug classes for our pull and treat antimicrobials? And first I'll say, I'm not a veterinarian, I'm a researcher, so work with your veterinarian. But yes, we do. I mean, we use the latest regimen, Nufor, Baytril, XC. Almost always use a macrolide for metaphylaxis though.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richeson.